All right. We're going to be talking about the nitrogen cycle today. And this constitutes the first part of the unit on biogeochemical cycles. So we've moved from talking about land system change and water and those topics to biogeochemical cycling. So here's some things that I would expect you to be able to do in this unit. And just reminding you about the planetary boundaries framework that we've been using thus far, we are now in this one. So looking at biogeochemical flows, and we're going to talk about nitrogen and phosphorus. And then I'm also going to conclude some things about carbon cycling, because carbon, even though it will feed directly into our understanding of climate change, because we measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as an indicator of climate change, I talk about the carbon cycle here as part of these biogeochemical flows because of the theme of cycling of these nutrients in the planet. And then finally, one other topic that's going to be covered in here is mineral resources, really just in part because it doesn't perfectly fit in any other category. Hopefully you're starting to see by now, however, the ways in which these planetary boundaries influence each other. So, land system change and climate change and biosphere integrity, these are all interrelated concepts. So nitrogen, first of all, nitrogen is a plentiful element on our planet. So the composition of the atmosphere is up to 78% nitrogen. And this is in the form of N2, which is diatomic nitrogen, or nitrogen gas. So I like to pull out this little laser pointer. So looking here, right, so just a little refresher on chemistry, and you're going to see a bit of chemistry in today's talk. So this would be two atoms of nitrogen that are bound onto each other, forming a very stable gas that, again, is going to compose about 78% of the atmosphere. The rest of the atmosphere being roughly these other elements and compounds, right? So carbon dioxide, argon, other things that we're going to learn about, and then oxygen, of course, which we need to breathe. So these other forms of nitrogen are going to be referred to as reactive nitrogen in a lot of the things that you're reading, right? So if you think about, if you've all had some chemistry at some point, that these different molecules are either more or less reactive, which means that they have a tendency to go into chemical reactions and form new compounds. So diatomic nitrogen is this very stable gas that's what we would call unreactive. And you'll see in a second that it takes a whole lot of energy to force nitrogen gas to go into a chemical reaction and become something else. However, these forms of nitrogen are kind of readily moving from one form to another throughout the environment. Okay, so what is the nitrogen cycle? This is what the nitrogen cycle would look like without human interference. So we have most of nitrogen being atmospheric nitrogen, and it can be fixed through bacteria. They can live in legume nodules, they live in other places in the soil, and so the nitrogen gets pulled into the soil, right, through this process we call nitrogen fixation. And then the nitrogen fixation, it's going to become ammonium, right? And I'm going to show you a little bit more specific. This is a kind of general overview, but I'm going to give you some more specifics in a minute. So this is going to move into ammonium, which is NH4. And then the ammonium is going to break down into nitrites and nitrates. So the ammonium will, it goes through a process called nitrification, and then it'll become nitrites, which is NO2. And then through nitrifying bacteria, it'll become nitrates, which is NO3. And this is the important part. This is what gets assimilated into plants. Okay, so these nitrates get taken into plants, and then those plants will go ahead and use nitrogen for their various processes. So plants need nitrogen and phosphorus and some other nutrients in order to grow, which we talked about with the green revolution slides. So again, this can happen like this. If you have too many nitrates in the soil, these denitrifying bacteria will take those nitrates and they will return them to this diatomic nitrogen atmospheric formulas, or atmospheric compound. So again, this nitrogen is cycling, right? And then so it's going from gas into the soil, moving through these different states in the soil, and then going back into the atmosphere. Also through the process of decomposition. So when things such as plants and animals, when they die, they have a lot of nitrogen in their bodies, and decomposers will break those down into ammonium through the process of ammonification, and then the cycle will continue. So waste, food waste, human waste, all of those things have a lot of nitrogen in them, which will come up again later. So this is what we would call the, quote, natural nitrogen cycle, or nitrogen cycle without human technological intervention. I'm going to show you the chemical reactions. I will not ask you to balance these chemical formulas or even to show me the chemical reactions. I am showing these to you because some of you have hopefully had a solid chemistry background, and this is actually going to be helpful for thinking about these processes, right? So here we see this diatomic nitrogen. It's going to actually be combined with water to create the ammonium, and then with some other byproducts, right? Nitrification, right? You're going from the ammonium to our nitrites, right? With some other byproducts, and then from nitrites to the nitrates. And then in the process of denitrification, you're seeing the process reversed again to produce our diatomic nitrogen. Okay, so how have we altered the cycle? I'm going to talk about this conceptually, and then I'm going to show you a different diagram. So first of all, and first and foremost, is the Haber-Bosch process. So scientists Haber and Bosch, both German scientists, came up with this process that we know as the Haber-Bosch process. And what that does is it takes nitrogen from the atmosphere and it fixes it into ammonium. And so that process allows us to take this gaseous molecule that otherwise had this very slow fixed rate at which it could be brought into the soil, and we speed that process up. And through that, we make fertilizer, okay? And so we can purchase fertilizer that has nitrogen that was made through the Haber-Bosch process. And then it would also have phosphorus in it, which we will talk about where that phosphorus comes from in a different lecture. And then, right, and then so there's other ways that fertilizer can get into the system, right? So human waste can also be used as fertilizer. Animal waste can be used as fertilizer, which many of you, if any of you have spent any time on a farm, that is a very common way of getting nutrients into the soil through cow manure or horse manure. And so these are other sources in the sense that we've kind of intensified the use of or the production of human and animal waste. That's a way that we've also altered the system. And then we also have fossil fuels, right? So fossil fuels, some when they are burned can give off reactive nitrogen as a byproduct. And then animal waste, which I mentioned here with this was our sewage and septic tank, but then animal waste also can be used as a fertilizer, or it can just be put into cesspools as it is sometimes on factory farms. Nitrogen cycle today, one thing I didn't mention is some nitrogen gets fixed naturally through lightning. I've always thought that was kind of cool. So this is what our nitrogen cycle looks like today. Again, some of these were on the other slide, and then some of these we've added on. So humans are putting fertilizers into the soil. Some of that's going to run off and cause that process of eutrophication we've talked about a bit. And then fossil fuel emissions is also going to put reactive nitrogen into our atmosphere. So this is some major ways that we've changed the nitrogen cycle. And I've got a couple different diagrams here that are just different ways of showing you the same thing, right? So what are different ways we can think about nitrogen moving through the planet? and the Earth's systems, right? So, you know, this sort of traditional process, if you will, of nitrogen cycling through soil and plants. But then, of course, we have so much fertilizer going into the system. Some of that is going to go ahead and leach and move into the ocean, and it will react and interact with organisms there. So again, in the reading, all these ideas of reactive nitrogen and what's that doing to our planet, that's all this extra stuff kind of moving around. This is just a different way of conceptualizing, kind of different emphasis on different things in that process, but overall similar things that we're looking at. There's a little thing up here of ozone because nitrogen can have a role in that as well, but don't worry about that so much right now. We do have a lecture on ozone later. Okay, so source of nitrogen. Again, the Haber-Bosch process of ammonia synthesis. I want you to understand a little bit about this process, mostly so you can understand just how energy intensive it is. So nitrogen coming in from the air, you basically take these different gases and you force them through a machine that is going to go ahead and use a lot of energy to produce liquid ammonia. And actually, I like this one better, but I think it's a little bit more complicated. So this is your less complicated version here. Here's the more complicated, but then also more accurate. So again, we're going to have natural gas, which is methane, and water coming in. We have our nitrogen coming in. It goes through these crazy processes of heating and reactions to come out with ammonia in the end. A few interesting points here. The Haber-Bosch process is going to produce about 32 gigajoules. That's 8,900 kilowatt hours per metric ton produced. And again, for that same ton, we're talking about 2 tons of carbon dioxide. So just 3 to 5% of global emissions for production of fertilizer. So very energy intensive process, which again, when we come up with these, when we talk about these themes of sustainability, whenever you have a one-way intensive process, you can't push nature in one direction forever, right? Eventually you'll run out of energy, you'll run out of resources. Okay, so we've already talked about this problem of fertilizer runoff into our oceans, right? And so this is just showing you nitrogen deposition and where it's ending up on the planet, essentially. As you will notice, right, some areas of major agriculture, you're going to see major amounts of nitrogen deposition, and then in the surrounding coastal areas in particular, it will be in higher concentrations. Okay, I want you to take a moment, pause this, if you will, and read this paragraph that comes out of, so this is a little activity to help you gauge your understanding at this point. So pause the video and read this paragraph and go ahead and translate it into English. And what I mean by that is less jargony, easy to understand English, and talk about how, you know, I'm going to go ahead and argue that this is one of the main points of the article that you read. So I want you to take a moment, reread it, and think about its meaning. So hopefully, if you took the time to do that, you realized that there's a few different themes here that are really important, okay? So first of all, it's this idea of nitrogen being moved and transported throughout the planet, right? So there's exportation, there's the creation of fertilizer, and it's being exported and moving around the planet. Now, what's interesting is that we're going to lose a lot of this in food production process, and it's going to end up in the nearby environment. So we're going to be not only transporting nitrogen around the planet in the form of fertilizer, but then we re-transport that food around the planet. So just think about it, like the fertilizer, it gets moved or it gets made, it gets moved around the planet, and then it ends up in certain areas. So here they're saying that a lot of this nitrogen is going to remain in a place where it's going to go ahead and pollute groundwater. It's going to you're going to have kind of this ambient ammonia and particle emissions that is going to be, the people living there are going to have to deal with this. And yet notice most of this food is being exported, right? So this is, again, what we're doing as we're moving chemicals around the globe through our market system. We're often leaving the negative impacts of production in places where people aren't receiving the benefit. And then again here, this figure is showing you a similar concept, which is essentially that, again, we're looking at fertilizer and then grain and then meat. And the idea is all of these things require large amounts of nitrogen at some point in the process. And so where are these things being traded, right? So fertilizer, where's it being produced? Where's it ending up? And then again with grains and with meat. So the take-home point being that we're, obviously this nitrogen is in this atmosphere all over the globe. However, we're actually fixing it in certain places. We're producing grains in certain places. We're producing meat in certain places. And net, we're moving this nitrogen around the globe in vast quantities in this reactive forms. So first of all, the articles, and this is another thing that comes up with phosphorus cycling, there's this idea of nitrogen, the inefficiencies, if you will, of the use of nitrogen. And I don't mean inefficiencies in the economic sense. In fact, in many ways, it's the opposite. It's the inefficiencies of the actual product itself. We lose a lot of nitrogen to the surrounding environments. We tend to over-fertilize crops or not fertilize them in the best targeted way. And then we do not harvest nitrogen from people and animals in a very efficient way, in part because of these monocrop and monoculture systems make it hard to move nitrogen from one organism or from one area to another. And then also because of, let's just say the ick factor, human waste is often not used as much as it could be to fertilize plants. Although, in fact, increasingly, and this was shown in some of those septic videos, increasingly we're seeing that biopellets are being made from the waste in septic systems. In fact, REWA right here, they do make some biopellets from the end sort of waste product. And they can use those to sell to farmers, not for vegetables, but for some soil regeneration in fields. Okay, so I talked a lot about the sort of last point I want you to get from this topic in these readings is this idea about reactive nitrogen. So reactive nitrogen has environmental and it has health impacts. And in one of the readings, it talks extensively about what these are. So as you did the reading, again, a moment to sort of pause this video and quiz yourself. Could you list the environmental and health impacts of reactive nitrogen? So going back to, again, this was, this is from Fowler et al. 2013. I was thinking it was from the Erisman article, but there's something similar that you all have. So again, it's this idea of what are the impacts of all these different types of nitrogen that we find in our environment. And this is from the Erisman 2013 article where it's showing you, first of all, nitrate and nitrate intake is hazardous to human health. It can actually bind on to, I believe, your red blood cells, and it prevents us from absorbing oxygen well. It's particularly dangerous for pregnant women and babies. And then also air pollution, right? So reactive nitrogen can be in the air and it can cause air pollution problems. It can actually, that air pollution can then contaminate crops. So it can fall back to the earth either as acid rain or actually just kind of interacting with the leaves of crops directly. There's freshwater pollution, biodiversity loss. So all these things that we have that are associated with reactive nitrogen in the environment. So we're, by our inefficient use of nitrogen and our inability to recycle it effectively, we're creating all of these problems, and all of these problems would be, external to our market system. So basically nobody's paying for these problems. they're just being caused, and the people benefiting from the production of nitrogen don't have to kind of take these into account. Which is one of the reasons why sustainability and doing things the right way is expensive, because those people are paying for more of those externalities are actually internalized in the process itself. Okay, that's all I have to say about nitrogen, and we'll see you next time.